There's a particular kind of silence that only appears when the world unexpectedly dims, when the electricity cuts off. And the machines that fill the background with their constant hum suddenly vanish into stillness. It's not the absence of noise that makes it feel so strange. It's the presence of everything else. It's the sound of your own breath. It's a faint shifting of fabric as you move. The heartbeat you didn't notice before. That's how it began one night in a quiet city building where two neighbors who spent years avoiding each other were suddenly made aware, fully, sharply, unmistakably of each other's presence in the dark. Their apartments faced one another across a narrow hallway, close enough to exchange sighs through the walls, to hear a dropped spoon, to feel the tremor of footsteps overhead. They weren't strangers exactly, but they'd never been anything else. There was tension, yes. Constant thrum of something unspoken between them. Petty complaints, accidental glances. Doors closed too quickly, too loudly. But underneath it, beneath the carefully folded politeness and cool indifference, was something warmer. Something restless. Something neither of them had ever dared to name. It wasn't hate. Not really. It was the kind of friction that builds when two people try not to notice each other for too long. The kind that sharpens awareness with every encounter. That kind of energy never fully disappears, it waits. And that night, when the building slipped into darkness, the waiting stopped. Because when the lights went out and the distractions fell silent, there was no more pretending. Only breath. Only shadows. Only the sound of someone else lighting a match. Just behind the wall. You may have felt it yourself before, that rush of awareness that rises in a moment of stillness. The flickering closeness of someone you never allowed yourself to imagine. The thick air between two people who've shared nothing, and yet everything. That's what this story is made of. The quiet pull of attention too deep to explain. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but seeps into the room like candle smoke. Slow, lingering, undeniable. So tonight, as you settle in, I invite you to breathe deeper. Let your thoughts drift to this hallway, this building, this moment. Picture the glow of soft candlelight reflecting off two wine glasses and the curve of two silhouettes drawn together, not by choice, but by something far more intimate: necessity, isolation, and the hunger to feel anything other than alone. If you're enjoying the warmth of this space, this voice, this unfolding, I gently invite you to subscribe or leave a small trace of yourself in the comments. This means more than you know. Because this story isn't just theirs, it's yours too. A gentle exploration of proximity, of reluctant attraction, of unexpected surrender. There's no need to rush. Every word is a breath. Every image a touch. Let it wash over you. Let it fill the quiet space you've made for yourself tonight. Let the world fall away until all that's left is this moment, and the sound of something about to shift. There is a glass of wine trembling slightly in a hand. A match just struck. A look held longer than it should be. Every gesture they make now feels loaded with history, with denial. The ache of what's been buried beneath habit and routine. And as the darkness deepens around them, so too does their awareness. Not just of the other, but of themselves in relation to the other. The want, the wait, the wondering. It's all there, smoldering quietly between candlelit breaths. You see, we don't always fall into desire through romance. Sometimes it's resentment that sharpens our senses. Sometimes it's the act of resisting that builds the fire higher. And sometimes it takes losing power to feel your own pull toward someone else. To hear the rhythm of your blood beside theirs, and the hush between words never said. That's what they're beginning to feel now. Not love, not yet, but the first real tremor of something impossible to ignore. So let yourself feel it too. Let your fingers rest. Let your eyes soften. Let the warmth beneath your skin rise and meet this story wherever it lands in you. You don't need to do anything, just listen. Let this slow unraveling pull you into the dark with them, into the tension, into the wine. Into the moment before a line is crossed, when everything still feels suspended. All they have is the flame, the silence, and each other. There's something deliciously fragile about the moment right before everything changes. It's quiet, like a held breath, still like a touch not yet given. And the smallest thing, a word, a step, a glance can tilt the whole night into something irreversible. They feel it in the dark now across the candlelit divide. That barely their gravity that exists only between two people trying not to fall, but falling all the same. A drop of wax trails slowly down the side of a candle. A sigh escapes, soft as silk, against the hush. The bottle uncorks with a pop that echoes far too loud in the stillness. These tiny sounds become enormous, intimate. They reveal how close they really are, how few steps it would take, how little resistance remains. The world outside is gone. What's left is this. Two bodies suspended in the golden hush of possibility, with nothing to distract them from what they've always tried not to feel. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most vulnerable place of all. Not in confession, not in touch, but in the slow realization that you're no longer pretending not to want. That this silence between you is no longer empty, but full. Full of hesitation, of heat, of half-imagined what-ifs. And now neither of them knows how to step away without shattering the fragile stillness they've both begun to crave. If you're still here with me, listening, breathing, drifting softly through these images, thank you. This space we share, quiet, curious, tenders, what gives the story its warmth. Let it hold you, just like they're holding back, or trying to. But tension has its own gravity, and sometimes gravity wins. So rest your head. Let your body soften. Let this voice become the flicker in the dark. This is not a story about neighbors. It's about nearness. It's about the kind of nearness that makes everything else fall away. And just maybe about how a flicker of flame can illuminate not just a room, but everything you've been avoiding feeling. Close your eyes if you wish, and stay with them. They're right there. It's two people, two glasses, and one night that doesn't follow the usual rules. Because in this kind of darkness, anything can happen. The first thing she noticed wasn't the darkness itself, it was the quiet that bloomed in its wake. Sudden and complete, swallowing every hum, every mechanical murmur, every subtle vibration of modern life. The kind of quiet that doesn't announce itself gently, but arrives all at once, as though the city took one great breath and chose not to exhale. And in that instant, glass in hand, body suspended between motion and stillness, she became aware of him, not with her eyes or ears, but with something deeper, more primal. The awareness of proximity, of presence. He was there, beyond her walls, across the hallway, breathing the same charged air, listening to the same silence. And somehow, impossibly, she felt that his attention, like hers, had turned inward, and then outward then toward her. It wasn't the first time she had sensed him like this, though she always pretended otherwise. There had been glances through barely opened doors, clipped conversations in the elevator, terse exchanges by the mailbox. There had been tension, yes, but not the loud, volatile kind. This was quiet, slow-burning, the kind that coils beneath civility, wrapped tight in sarcasm and lingering gazes that last a second too long. But tonight something had changed. The silence felt fuller, thicker, as though the electricity hadn't just cut the lights, but peeled back a veil between them, exposing what had always lived in the in-between. The unanswered questions, the near touch of hands, the invisible line they both danced around and never dared to cross. She didn't mean to light the candle with such ceremony, but the act felt sacred. The strike of the match, sharp and quick, echoed louder than expected in the still air. Flame bloomed orange and warm, licking the darkness away 1 inch at a time. She watched it grow, her breath held in something like reverence, and in that golden flicker, the apartment transformed. No longer sterile and modern, it felt older, quieter, like a room pulled from another time, one where secrets were whispered over wine, where glances held weight, and where the line between hate and want blurred under the hush of candlelight. The shadows moved with her, and something inside her stirred an ache, an anticipation, a memory not yet lived, but deeply felt. Then came the sound. A single footstep beyond the door, deliberate and unhurried, followed by silence thick with meaning. She froze, not in fear, but in recognition. Her body understood before her mind could catch up. He was there close, just on the other side. She imagined him, standing in the hallway barefoot, holding his own candle, the flickering light painting his face in golden shadow. Maybe he hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Or maybe he knew exactly what this was. She took a step closer, slowly, her fingers curling tighter around the warm base of the candle. Each movement felt heavy with intention, as though the moment demanded care, demanded presence. And in that sacred stillness, she allowed herself to wonder, what if this was the moment everything shifted? She heard the faintest clink of glass wine against bottleland. Her breath hitched. It was a sound so familiar and yet tonight so charged. Her mouth parted slightly. Her spine tingled. Something deep inside her unfurled, ancient and aching and ready. She hadn't invited him, not with words. But maybe that wasn't necessary. Maybe this wasn't about language. Maybe it was about need. About the way two people can orbit each other for years, burning slow in separate silences, until one night the world goes quiet and their gravity collapses into something undeniable. She moved toward the door without thinking, her steps light, her chest full. Her fingers found the handle, but paused there. Not out of doubt, but because some part of her wanted to savor the moment before the world changed. The knock soft, tentative landed like a question against the wood. She didn't answer with words. She opened. Slowly, and there he stood, candle in hand, eyes unreadable, and yet somehow entirely open. For a long breath, neither of them moved. The hallway around them flickered in amber hues, the silence no longer empty but intimate. He raised the bottle, a simple gesture, and she nodded. No smiles, no greetings, just understanding. She stepped aside and he entered. The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt final and full of promise. The air in the room shifted, denser now, scented faintly with wax and wine and something else, something like longing unspoken. He moved through her space with a stillness that matched her own. Their footsteps slow, the candlelight making everything feel quieter, more real. She studied him now, not in glances stolen across a hallway, but fully. The angles of his face, softened by the flame, the way his shirt clung to his collarbone, the way his fingers cradled the wine bottle with quiet strength. He looked different here among her things, framed by her walls, less guarded, less sharp. And yet, there was something unmistakably electric beneath his composure, like a storm held barely in check. He poured the wine with care, and she noticed the slight tremor in his hands. It matched her own. They sat close, but not touching on the couch, the candle between them casting long shadows on the floor. The first sip was slow, the wine rich and warm against their tongues. Still, they said nothing. But in that silence something else spoke, a language older than words, woven from tension and proximity, and the low pulse of anticipation that seemed to echo between them. Her shoulder brushed his barely, and she felt it in her knees. He turned toward her a fraction, and the air grew heavier. They were no longer neighbors, not in that moment, not in the hush of candlelight, not with the quiet hum of breath and wine and want coiling between them. There was no grand declaration, no sudden kiss, just stillness that thickened with every second, charged with the sense that something long held back was slowly finally unfolding. She looked at him then, not guarded or defiant, but open, vulnerable, and in his eyes she saw something that made her chest ache. He wasn't the enemy, not really. He was just someone who had been waiting. Someone who had watched her from his own little corner of solitude and pride, and maybe felt the same ache she did when their hands almost touched. The same stubborn yearning, and in that flickering light, with wine on their tongues and silence pressing softly between them, they felt it. The first thread of something new, not loud, not certain, but undeniably real. A shift, a breath held, a flame beginning to rise. Because sometimes connection doesn't shout. It waits in the quiet, in the dark, till two people finally see what's always been there, burning slow and steady, just waiting for the right night to catch fire. The wine lingered on her tongue, earthy and warm, as she tilted the glass slowly, letting it rest against her lips like a secret she wasn't ready to speak. Across from her, he mirrored the gesture without realizing it. His gaze cast low, but not unfocused, anchored to the table, to the flicker of the flame between them. Or perhaps to the way her fingers wrapped around the stem of the glass, careful, deliberate. The room felt suspended in amber light, timeless in its stillness. Outside, the city held its breath, electricity still absent, as if the entire world had dimmed to make space for this. And in that pocket of quiet, the space between them pulsed, not loud, not chaotic, but dense and waiting, like the moment before rain, like a cord strung tight across two hearts, trying not to tremble. Her leg brushed against his beneath the table, barely a touch. Featherlight and yet the spark it lit beneath her skin, was unmistakable. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. They stayed like that, breath steady, gaze drifting, as if acknowledging it would make it more dangerous. But the flicker had started, not the flame. Not yet. It's just the flicker, that small, sacred instability that lives in the space between people who haven't yet given in to what they want but have stopped pretending they don't. It wasn't sudden. It was the slow, inexorable shift of energy, the changing of tides, the heat that gathers in a room not from temperature, but from awareness. She leaned back just slightly, the candle casting shadows across her collarbone, and he looked at her really, looked, and something in his eyes changed. It wasn't hunger, not yet, not the raw urgency that would come later. It was something softer, something more dangerous. It's a realization of closeness, of possibility, and the weight of all the hours, the days, the quiet moments that had led them here. He took a slow breath and said her name, not loudly, not casually, but as if it were a question and a confession in one. She looked up, met his eyes fully, and the flicker pulsed again. Her lips parted slightly, a breath escaping, not quite a sigh, but not silence either. He didn't move, neither did she. But between them, something reached. Something fragile and full of tension, stretching through the air like silk caught in a breeze, asking for permission without words. She stood up first, slowly holding her wine in one hand and the candle in the other, the soft flame illuminating the curve of her wrist and the hollow of her throat. He watched her with stillness that wasn't passive, it was reverent. She crossed the room without looking back, barefoot on wood, each step careful but unhurried. She didn't ask him to follow. She didn't have to. The silence had become a language now, and every movement a sentence. When she stopped by the window, the candlelight brushed the outlines of her form, casting golden warmth against the night. She felt him behind her before she heard him. His presence filled the room like a slow tide, rising around her, touching everything without making contact. He set his glass down beside hers on the windowsill. And for a moment they stood there, not speaking, their reflections hovering side by side in the dark glass. The city was only a distant outline now, reduced to silhouettes and shadows. Doll. That was real existed within these four walls. Light, breath, presence. When he finally reached out, it was not to touch her skin, but to gently take the candle from her hand. His fingers grazed hers, brief but electrifying, and she felt the sensation travel like a shiver from her wrist to the center of her chest. He placed the candle down and turned to face her, no longer obscured by distance or flame, their bodies aligned in quiet symmetry. She could hear his breath now, slightly uneven, and it matched the rhythm of her own. There was a moment long and trembling when neither of them moved, and the only sound was the faint whisper of their breathing and the candle's low crackle. She could see everything in his expression, now the guarded tension, the reluctant admiration, the questions he had never asked. And beneath it all, the same current she had tried for so long to ignore. Desire, unspoken and undeniable. He reached toward her again, slower this time, as if asking with every inch of motion if she would let him cross the distance. Her answer came not in words, but in the way her body leaned in, not forward, but open, a yielding, not a chase, the invitation. His hand hovered near her waist, not quite touching. His eyes searched hers, waiting. When her fingers gently touched his wrist, that was all he needed. His palm came to rest just above her hip, warm and steady, not claiming, but discovering. She inhaled sharply, surprised by how much that single point of contact could feel like everything. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The flicker between them had become something more now, brighter, steadier. It glowed beneath their skin, in the subtle shift of their bodies, in the way his thumb brushed over the fabric of her dress like a breath. Her hand found its way to his chest, fingers splayed, feeling the quiet rhythm of his heart beneath his shirt. It was fast, and steady, and real. He placed his other hand over hers, as though to say, "Yes, this is me, and I'm here." She closed her eyes then, letting the warmth of him seep through her. It's not just the heat of his body, but the warmth of being seen, of being wanted not as a reaction, but as a choice. When she opened them again, he was closer. Not suddenly, not sharply, just closer, as if pulled by the same gravity that had been building between them since the first glance in the elevator, since the first disagreement that lasted longer than necessary. The flicker was no longer a question. It was a promise. A slow-burning promise that something had changed. That they had stepped over a line that would not disappear when the lights came back. She felt it in the way they looked at each other now, not with challenge, not with distance, but with something stripped bare, something quiet and glowing and new. The space between them had ceased to exist. They stood close enough to feel each other's breath, to share the same air, to know that the next movement, whatever it was, would be the one that rewrote everything. And still, they waited. Not out of hesitation, but reverence. Because the flicker wasn't just desire, it was recognition. It was history, untangling itself into something intimate and slow and sacred. And neither of them wanted to rush the moment it turned into flame. His fingertips reached for her slowly, as if moving through thick air, as if unsure whether the moment would hold or shatter beneath the weight of intention. She didn't step back, she didn't flinch. She remained still, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes tracing the movement of his hand like one might watch a candle. Flame fascinated, fragile, too precious to disturb, and then finally, the space closed. His fingers met her skin, a brush of contact at her waist. Not possessive, not demanding, just a question asked without words, and she answered not with sound, but with stillness, with the slight tilt of her head, with the way her eyes softened and lowered just enough to show she felt it too. That first real touch did not ignite fireworks or demand action. It simply ... lingered, and in that lingering, something deeper stirred. Her hand found its way to his forearm, her palm resting lightly against the fabric of his shirt. It was a grounding touch, not seeking but affirming, as if reminding both of them that they were here, that this was real. The warmth of his skin beneath the cotton met hers in silence, and the silence stretched not awkward, but reverent. Her thumb moved ever so slightly in a slow, absent circle, and he exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound that spoke more than words could have. He stepped in closer, closing the breath of space between them, his other hand rising until it hovered near her jawline, unsure, reverent, trembling with restraint. When his fingers finally reached the curve of her cheek, it was like touching something sacred, warmth and presence, and the quiet thunder of possibility. Her eyes closed, then not to escape, but to feel. To truly feel. The texture of his palm against her skin, the warmth of his breath so close to her own, the stillness of a room holding two people caught between restraint and longing, I say. And in that quiet, the memory of all their glances, their arguments, their silences echoed through her. Every time she had rolled her eyes at him, every time he had avoided looking at her too long, every sharp reply and clipped command, they had all led here. To this impossibly tender moment where time slowed and the world outside ceased to matter. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with a care that made her chest ache, as if he were memorizing her face through the pads of his fingers, one breath at a time. Their foreheads met softly, naturally, as though gravity had decided for them. In that closeness, everything quieted. No kiss, not yet. Just closeness. Just warmth. Just the press of skin against skin, the subtle tremble of restraint held tight. He whispered her name again, barely audible, and she felt it like a chord strummed low across her spine. Her fingers curled gently against his chest, feeling the flutter of his breath beneath her touch, the rhythm of a heart not yet racing, but on the edge of something wild. She spoke then, not to break the spell, but to wrap herself in it, a whisper shaped only by breath, "Don't move." Not because she didn't want him to, but because she wanted to feel this moment suspended, just a little longer, untouched by everything that might come after. He obeyed, his hands resting gently where they were on her cheek, on her waist, as if he, too, didn't want to break the stillness. They stood like that for what could have been seconds or hours, wrapped in golden silence. Wrapped in the flickering shadow of the candlelight and the heat that had begun to bloom low and deep in their bodies. And then, without ceremony, without decision, her lips brushed his cheek. Not a kiss. Not fully. Just a touch. A moment of skin meeting skin in the softest, most electric way possible. His breath caught. Her lips lingered. And when she pulled back, she didn't go far. Her eyes opened and found his again clear, calm, and wanting. Something in him shifted then. A line he'd been holding inside gave way, and the hand at her waist tightened just slightly, just enough for her to feel the change. Not demand, not possession, just presence. just the quiet gravity of a man who had stopped pretending not to feel what he felt. She stepped in, her body aligning with his, her arms sliding up around his shoulders, as if they had always belonged there. His hands moved too, slow and deliberate, one finding the small of her back and the other cradling her nape, fingers tangling gently in her hair. She rested her head against his shoulder, their bodies curved into one shape, and in that embrace the world disappeared. There was no rush, no urgency, just the slow recognition that the line had been crossed, and there would be no going back. He pressed his cheek against her temple, breathing in the scent of her, warm, soft, familiar in a way that startled him. Her hands moved across his back in slow, calming arcs, not seeking to excite but to feel, to memorize the shape and weight of him beneath her fingers. They stood swaying in place, no music but their breath, no rhythm but the one their hearts created together. And in that motionless dance, something bloomed. Not fire, not yet, but heat. A deep, pulsing warmth that moved through their bodies with reverence. She turned her face into his neck, and he felt her exhale there, felt the flutter of her lashes against his skin, the press of her lips just beneath his jaw. And still, she didn't kiss him. Not yet. Instead, she lingered there, held close in silence, as though the real intimacy was not in the kiss, but in everything that came before it, in the way they touched with intention, in the way they held each other without needing to speak, in the way their bodies communicated what their pride had silenced for so long. He let his eyes close, let his hands rest more fully against her, and let himself feel her, not just her skin, but her. The full presence of the woman he had underestimated, admired, challenged Dan now, could no longer resist. In that embrace, words became useless. Time unraveled, and all that existed was breath, heat, closeness. The lights might return, the world might call them back. But here now, wrapped in each other, they had stepped into a different kind of moment. One made of touch and quiet and all the things that finally no longer needed to be said. Their bodies remained close, breath still mingling, but it was their eyes now that carried the full weight of what they both refused to name aloud. When she finally pulled back just enough to see him, their gazes collided in a quiet storm, neither fierce nor fragile, but electric in its stillness. Her eyes, so often sharp with wit or narrowed in challenge, now glistened with something softer, something unguarded. There was a question in them, but not one that demanded an answer, just an invitation. A gentle request to stay in this space a little longer, to not pull away, to not deny what they both already knew. And his eyes, once always scanning the room, calculating, keeping distance, were now fixed only on her. Wide open, present, speaking every emotion his voice had never dared utter. No smile played at her lips. There was no need for it. The moment wasn't light. It was full, weighted, sacred. She looked into him as if peeling away years of misread intentions. Silent doubts, clashing egos. Gaze searched him not with suspicion but with curiosity, tentative, real. He felt it like heat rising in his chest, like the slow untangling of a knot he hadn't realized had been strangling him. Every breath she took seemed to pull something from him, something buried, something vulnerable. And when he blinked, slow and heavy, it was as if surrendering to her was the only logical thing left. Their eyes did not dart or flinch or shy away. They stayed.
Held.
They told. In those seconds, she saw him as she never had. Not just the sharp suits, the calculated tone, the walls built high and sealed tight. She saw the fatigue behind his eyes, the constant pressure beneath his calm, the loneliness dressed in self-control. He saw her not the sarcasm, not the polite disobedience, not the brilliance she wore like armor, but the weariness in her stare, the longing she never admitted, the vulnerability she kept hidden beneath confidence. And so they stood, barely touching but entirely seen. There was no performance here, no pretending. Just one gaze holding another in a space too fragile to speak into. She tilted her head slightly, not in question, but in revelation, as if silently saying, "I see you." And he inhaled sharply, his throat tightening with the rush of emotion. Her stare awoke in him. He didn't look away, couldn't. Her eyes held him there, not with force but with gravity. and in them he saw flashes of memories that hadn't even happened. Yet mornings with sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds, laughter spilling in quiet kitchens, fingers brushing while reaching for the same book. He saw a version of his life that had always felt too far away until now, until her. And in his silence, she knew. She knew what he was seeing because she saw it too. There was something ancient in that moment, something that felt older than the room around them, older than this night. It was as though they had been having this conversation across lifetimes, always just nearly missing each other, always arriving late or leaving too soon. But here they were, finally aligned, finally still, finally seeing one another. And her breath caught as she realized just how much he had been holding back, not just from her, but from himself. His eyes shimmered not with tears, but with the overwhelming realization that he no longer wanted to hide, that he no longer could. She reached up then, slowly, her fingertips brushing his cheek, eyes never breaking from his. Her touch wasn't an answer, was a continuation of the dialogue already unfolding in silence. Her thumb traced the edge of his jaw, soft and slow, and he leaned into it, eyes fluttering half-closed as if overwhelmed by the way her presence anchored him. Her hand, warm and steady, cradled his face like a truth too delicate to name. Still they did not kiss. Not yet. The moment was not about lips or breath. It was about recognition, about reflection, about two souls caught in a stare that spoke everything their pride had swallowed for months. He raised his hand to hers, holding it gently in place against his face, his fingers curling around hers like he was afraid she'd vanish if he'd let go. His brows furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in awe. She had undone him with nothing but a look, with a single sustained gaze that stripped him bare and rebuilt him at the same time. And she felt seen, finally, completely. Her pulse thrummed in her throat, her chest tight with emotion she hadn't known she'd buried so deep. And the silence wrapped around them like velvet, thick and soundless, letting them exist outside of time. They said nothing, because everything had already been said. In that shared breath, in that unwavering gaze, in the way their eyes softened and filled and held, her lips parted, not to speak, but just to take in more air, more of him. And he watched her like one watches dawn break through fogs, low, unstoppable, luminous. The space between them pulsed, humming with everything unsaid, everything unfinished. And still, they lingered there, unmoving, unwilling to break the spell. When her hand finally slipped down from his cheek, it was not in retreat but in reverence. She let her fingers trail down his collar, slow and lingering, until they rested against his chest. Feeling the warmth there, the beat of something real. He lowered his gaze for just a moment, only to close his eyes and press his forehead lightly against hers again, letting their closeness seal what their eyes had confessed. And in that exhale, in that silence, in that connection, they both knew they had crossed something far deeper than a line of touch. They had stepped into something wordless, and it would never be undone. Even as they stood apart, the space between them buzzed with something too charged to ignore. It wasn't just chemistry, it was gravity, silent magnetism that pulled their bodies, their minds, their desires into quiet alignment. She walked away first, slowly, needing air, needing to think, needing to move, but every step away from him felt like a betrayal of something her body wasn't ready to leave behind. Her fingers tingled where they had touched him, and the skin of her palm still pulsed from resting against his chest. She turned her back, trying to regain control, but even in distance, she could feel him, the heat of him, the weight of his eyes, the promise that lingered in the room like incense. He watched her go, but didn't move. He knew that if he followed now, it would be irreversible. And something in him, a sliver of hesitation born from a lifetime of restraint, held him still. But only for a moment, because his chest ached with the effort of holding back, and his hands clenched at his sides, as if struggling to contain the need to reach for her again. She stopped at the edge of the room, her fingers curling into the edge of the countertop, breathing hard as if wrestling with herself. And he saw it, the way her shoulders trembled, the way her body leaned slightly back toward him despite her will. And that was all he needed. One small betrayal of her self-control, and he crossed the distance. He didn't speak when he reached her. Words felt inadequate, unnecessary. Instead, he stood behind her, not touching, just allowing his presence to fill the space around her. She closed her eyes, exhaling shakily, and when his hand hovered just above her hip, not yet landing, she didn't flinch. She leaned. Barely, but enough. And then, as if compelled by something deeper than conscious thought, he let his hand rest there, gentle but firm, grounding her, claiming nothing but offering everything. Her breath hitched, her body going still, and she let herself feel it, his warmth seeping through her, the steadiness of his touch like a silent vow. She turned slowly, as if caught in a current too strong to resist, and when her eyes found his again, they no longer held hesitation, just surrender. Not of dignity or power, but of the walls they'd both held up for far too long. His hand moved up, brushing her rib cage, thumb grazing the edge of her arm as if memorizing her shape, and she let him. Her hands came up to his chest, not pushing, not pulling, just resting, open, trembling slightly. They stood like that, breathing each other in, their closeness a bomb and a fire all at once. His thumb traced slow circles at the base of her spine, anchoring her while everything inside her seemed to unravel. There was no urgency in their movements, only depth, only intention. The pull between them wasn't just lust, it was recognition, a longing that had simmered beneath arguments and glances, beneath sarcasm and silence, now unleashed in stillness. She tilted her head, brushing her nose against his, her lips so close he could taste her breath, and still they didn't kiss. Not yet. Because the tension was sacred, and they both wanted to savor the ache of anticipation, to linger in the heat that danced just above the surface of a touch they had denied themselves for so long. His hand slid up her spine, fingers splaying across her back, pulling her infinitesimally closer until their foreheads touched again, a gesture now familiar and devastating. Her fingers tightened slightly against his chest, grounding herself against the intensity rising in her, and he whispered not with words, but with breath, with presence, with the way his body curved toward hers like a question finally asking to be answered. Her hand slipped up around his neck, threading into the base of his hair, and she felt him shudder at the contact, his breath catching as if her touch had unlocked something buried too long. They swayed slightly, not dancing, but moving to a rhythm only their bodies knew. A silent song composed of glances, memories, repressed smiles, and late-night thoughts neither had dared admit before now. And when his nose brushed against her cheek, his lips grazing the edge of her skin without pressing fully, she sighed a low, deep, aching sound that told him everything. It wasn't just desire. It was need. It was history. It was inevitability. And still, they held themselves at the edge, trembling on the precipice of something vast. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Why does this feel so impossible to stop?" And he answered not with a sentence, but with the way his arms wrapped around her waist and pulled her close. Every inch of their bodies aligning, no space left between them. "Because it is," he murmured against her temple, his lips brushing her skin like silk, like confession. "Because I don't want to stop." And in that breath, in that simple truth, the last of her resistance cracked. She let her head fall against his shoulder, eyes closed, arms clinging to him as if he were the only real thing left in a world gone quiet. The pull between them had become a tide-slow, inevitable, all-consuming, not something to fight, but something to follow. And as they stood there, no longer neighbors, no longer opponents, no longer pretending just two souls trembling beneath the weight of all they'd suppressed, they both knew this was the beginning of something they'd never be able to undo. They didn't want to. There was no longer peace in the silence between them. There was heat palpable, rising, undeniable. She stood near the edge of the dimly lit room, where shadows curled softly against the walls like whispers of forgotten promises. Her breath was shallow, uneven, and her fingertips trembled as they brushed lightly against the cool surface of the countertop. The faint flicker of candlelight played across her skin, casting warm glows and deep shadows that seemed to dance with the rhythm of her quickening pulse. The air around her felt charged, thick with an invisible current pulling between them, something raw and urgent that neither dared to name aloud. Every nerve in her body was alive, buzzing with the electricity of his presence just a few heartbeats away. Even though he hadn't moved, she felt him behind her, an unseen force. the gravity of the moon tugging at restless tides inside her chest. Her thoughts, once clear and steadfast, had dissolved into a haze of memory and sensation. Fragmented glimpses of moments too close, too intense to unravel. She gripped the edge of the counter tighter, trying to steady herself, but it was like bracing against a storm she had willingly summoned the moment her defenses faltered, and she didn't pull away from his lingering touch. He watched her from the opposite side of the room, his eyes heavy with a mix of desire and hesitation that made his entire being ache. It wasn't just a physical distance anymore. It was a fragile emotional chasm stretching between them, taut with everything unsaid, everything long suppressed. His chest tightened painfully, as though each breath demanded more willpower than he could summon. He fought the overwhelming urge to close the gap between them instantly, fearing that any sudden move would ignite something wild and irreversible. But the stillness began to gnaw at him just as fiercely. The silence between them had morphed into a living thing, electric, alive with the tension of unspoken confessions, in quiet, desperate needs. When she tilted her head slightly, just enough to reveal the tender curve of her neck and the gentle rise and fall of her breath, it was as if a signal had been sent through the space that separated them. He no longer had the strength to resist. It's not because he wanted to break the silence, but because the silence had become unbearable, a hunger too deep to deny, like a thirst that could only be quenched by the closeness of her. Slowly, without a single word, he crossed the room. His steps were measured, deliberate, neither rushed nor hesitant, but heavy with the weight of what was to come. When he finally reached her, he didn't touch her immediately. Instead, he stood just behind her, so close that the heat radiating from his body brushed against her back, sending shivers down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat, her muscles tense, yet the edge of her resistance softened. The silence between them pulsed with the weight of all the moments they'd buried, frustrations muttered under breath, stolen glances exchanged in passing, imagined conversations whispered in dreams. His hand hovered above the curve of her hip, the space between them trembling with anticipation. Then, almost reverently, his fingers settled there, his touch as grounding as it was intimate. Her eyes fluttered closed as she leaned back, the smallest movement that spoke volumes. They were no longer holding back. Turning slowly, she faced him fully. The defiant walls she'd built around herself, crumbling in the softness of their gaze. There was no sarcasm or mask, left only the raw vulnerability of two people who had exhausted every excuse not to surrender to what was unfolding between them. His hand rose gently, fingertips tracing a tender path along her cheek, as if memorizing every contour. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing like a whispered prayer, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this kind of tenderness. Where once her hands clenched in silent resistance, now they opened, palms resting softly against his chest, quiet offering, a bridge between two worlds. His breath hitched beneath her touch, and he swayed slightly toward her, caught in the undertow of a connection neither could fully name, but both felt deep in their bones. They were no longer adversaries, no longer distant neighbors. They had become two souls helplessly drawn to a force that transcended the grudges and noise of the past. Time itself seemed to unravel. Seconds stretched and slowed, thickening into a sacred stillness that wrapped them like a fragile cocoon. Their bodies, mere inches apart, pulsed with a shared rhythm and unspoken dialogue of warmth and longing. When he lowered his forehead to hers, it was not a kiss, but a silent communion, a melding of breath and spirit. She let her hands wander, fingers threading through his hair with a reverence that mirrored the tremble she felt in her own chest. In that fragile moment, all doubts fell away. She no longer cared where this fragile spark would lead, whether it was a mistake or the beginning of something profound. Only the present existed, the charged, beautiful recklessness of now. His arms encircled her waist, holding her with a fierce protectiveness that was both possessive and tender. She melted into him, her body yielding like wax meeting flame, fitting to his contours, with a familiarity that startled them both. It was as if they were coming home to a truth they'd denied for far too long. His lips hovered near her temple, brushing her skin with a touch so soft it felt like a secret only they could share. He breathed in the scent of her hair, as if committing it to memory, afraid to forget even a single detail. She shivered in the warmth of his nearness, and when she finally lifted her face to his, eyes heavy and half-lidded, their mouths were just inches apart. But still, they did not kiss. Not yet. Because in the spaces between them, there was an exquisite acan, anticipation that deepened every breath, every touch, every stolen glance. Their hands traced each other's forms with reverence, honoring the slow burn of a desire that refused to be rushed. She whispered his name not as a question but as a recognition of something inevitable. He responded with the soft pressure of his thumb beneath her chin, tilting her face closer as if to recite a poem written just for them. She trembled in his arms, no longer ashamed of her vulnerability or her want. And when he pressed his forehead to hers once more, eyes squeezed shut, it was with the quiet reverence of a man who knew he had been wrong about everything except this. They were no longer enemies, were no longer just neighbors. They were falling. Slowly, deeply, with every breath and every heartbeat. The force pulling them together was no longer something to resist. It was a current they had chosen to surrender to, carrying them toward an intimate collision that promised more than either had dared to hope for. The night pressed gently against the windows, silence wrapping around them like velvet, thick and dark, as if the world outside had faded into stillness to make room for this moment. The only sounds in the room were the soft rhythms of their breathing and the faint hum of the city beyond, distant and unimportant. He sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped as if holding something fragile between them. She stood by the doorway, arms crossed, not out of defensiveness, but as if trying to hold herself together. The air between them still pulsed with that unspoken electricity, but now it had deepened into something more intimate, something heavy with meaning and emotion. Neither of them looked away. It was no longer a stare-off, no longer a silent contest for control. It was an unraveling, a meeting of two truths, too long buried under sarcasm and stolen glances. And in that shared quiet, the weight of all the things they hadn't said began to rise, shimmering in the dim light like smoke from a long-extinguished flame. She took a slow step forward, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the stillness with a clarity that startled them both. "I don't hate you," she said, the words trembling on her lips, as if unsure they deserved to exist. He lifted his gaze, his brows drawing together, not in confusion, but in a quiet disbelief that something he had longed to hear was finally being spoken aloud. Her throat tightened and she swallowed hard, trying to piece together the whirlwind of feelings clawing their way to the surface. "I never did," she continued, her voice soft but steady, like a thread unspooling slowly. "It was easier to pretend I did, easier than admitting you got under my skin." Her eyes shimmered with a flicker of vulnerability, the kind that felt like standing naked beneath a storm. "You irritated me, because you noticed things no one else did. Because you always challenged me. I didn't know how to handle that." He sat back slightly, his shoulders relaxing as something inside him cracked open, something old and rigid that had been holding him in place for far too long. His voice came slower, rougher, as though scraped up from a place he rarely visited. "You drive me crazy," he admitted, and a ghost of a smile tugged at her lips, not smug or triumphant, but quiet and aching. "Every time you walked past my door, I heard your footsteps. Every time I heard your laugh through the wall, I stopped what I was doing. I told myself it was just noise, but I was listening, always listening." His eyes were searching hers now, not for answers, but for permission. "I told myself I didn't care, but I noticed everything, every little detail, and it scared me." Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat, too raw, too real. Instead, she crossed the remaining space between them and sat beside him close, but not quite touching. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full dense with memory, sensation, and the slow crumbling of walls they no longer had the energy to keep standing. Her shoulder brushed his, and it was like a spark arced between them, grounding them both. "I heard you too," she said quietly, her voice almost breaking. "Your music, your pacing, your voice when you were on the phone late at night. I memorized the sound of your footsteps on the stairs. I waited for them, even when I pretended not to care. Even when I rolled my eyes or slammed the door a little harder than necessary." He turned toward her, his face close now, the shadows playing over his features in a way that made everything feel dreamlike and dangerously real. "So what are we doing?" he asked, his voice softer than it had ever been, stripped of its usual sharpness. "God. What is this between us?" His breath brushed her cheek, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting it sink into her. She didn't have a neat answer. No tidy explanation for the ache blooming in her chest. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I don't want to keep pretending anymore." And there it was, honesty, raw and quiet and terrifying. He reached for her hand then, fingers trembling slightly as they closed around hers. The contact was simple, but it sent a wave of warmth through her body that made her want to cry. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming release of finally being seen, of finally letting herself be held without armor. She clung to his hand as if it were the only real thing anchoring her in that room. "I thought pushing you away would make it easier," he murmured, his thumb brushing against the back of her hand in slow, soothing circles. "But it just made everything worse." She leaned her head gently against his shoulder, her voice muffled by the fabric of his shirt. "I built this whole version of you in my head. Someone arrogant, careless, cold. Because it was safer than admitting I liked the way you looked at me, liked how sharp you were, how you never let anything slide. It scared me how much I wanted you to see me." His chest rose slowly beneath her cheek, and she could feel the tension there, the fragile breath of a man who had wanted too much for too long, and was only now letting himself ask for it. "I always saw you," he said quietly, turning his face to press his lips against the crown of her head, "even when I pretended not to, especially then." They sat there for a long time, the warmth of their bodies melting into one another, till the line between proximity and intimacy disappeared completely. There were no grand gestures, no passionate declarations, only the soft confession of two people who had fought so hard to keep their distance, now slowly folding into one another, like pages of the same story. It wasn't perfect, it was awkward and tender and bruised by months of denial, but it was real. And in the quiet dark of that living room, something gentle and entirely new began to bloom. It was not the end of their friction, it was the beginning of understanding. The hours slipped past with the kind of slowness that doesn't bore, but rather wraps around the skin like a quiet warmth, like a Sunday morning that refuses to end. The light in the room had dimmed to a golden hue, one lamp illuminating the space where two people, once so certain of their distance now, sat in the softened hush of their unraveling walls. They weren't touching in any overt way, but their bodies kept drifting toward each other in quiet magnetic pulse, a shoulder brushing the edge of the other's, a knee shifting closer without thought, a hand resting just a breath away. Every inch that separated them felt alive, as though it trembled with unspoken questions and trembling answers. She wasn't even sure what they were talking about anymore, or if they were still talking at all. Words had begun to dissolve between them like mist, and what remained was something far more eloquent, the silence of two people learning how not to push each other away. She glanced over at him, and in the hush, her eyes lingered longer than they ever had before. She noticed the way his lashes curled near the corners, the faint dimple in his cheek when he wasn't even smiling, the way his chest rose and fell with a breath that seemed slightly less guarded now. It startled her, how tender he looked in this light. Or maybe it startled her that she had never allowed herself to see him this way before. She had been too busy resisting him, building walls from sarcastic remarks and eye rolls, too afraid to admit that his presence had always stirred something raw inside her. And now, with nothing left to hide behind, she felt herself beginning to want. Not just the nearness of him, not just the comfort of his attention, but the closeness that came with being known. With being seen even in the places she'd worked hardest to hide. He shifted slightly, his knee grazing hers, and neither of them moved away. The contact was electric in its subtlety, a quiet confirmation that the air had changed. He tilted his head and studied her with a softness she wasn't used to. "I used to wonder," he murmured, his voice nearly lost in the dim, "if maybe you hated me because you didn't know what else to do with the way I made you feel." Then she blinked at him, stunned into stillness by the accuracy of his words, by the bravery it took to say them. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the reply tangled in the knot in her throat. When it came, her voice was low and raw. "Maybe I did," she said. "Maybe I still don't." He didn't flinch at that. Instead, he smiled not with smugness, but with something deeper, more knowing. "I didn't hate you," he said after a pause. "I tried to. God, I tried. You drove me insane, but underneath it, there was always this ache. Like I was angry because I wanted to get close and couldn't figure out how." She looked away, heart thudding with something dangerously close to vulnerability. But then she felt his hand, just his fingertips, brush against the side of hers. Not a grab, not a demand, just an invitation. She let her fingers drift toward his slowly, hesitantly, and when they finally touched, it was like something long frozen inside her began to melt. The weight of that contact was almost unbearable in its intimacy. It wasn't lust. Not just that. It was the collapse of distance, the quiet surrender of walls once held up by pride and fear. She exhaled, shaky, as his thumb moved in slow, deliberate circles along the back of her hand. "This is different," she whispered, afraid that if she spoke too loud, the moment would vanish. "Yeah," he replied, leaning in just a little closer, "but I don't want to fight it anymore." Her chest rose, breath catching, and she looked into his eyes. For the first time, she let herself stay there. Not glance, not retreat. Just stay. "You make me feel like I'm always about to fall," she said, her voice a trembling confession. "And I've spent so long avoiding it, pretending I was above it, above you." He smiled again, sad and soft. "I've been waiting for you to fall," he murmured. "I've been falling this whole damn time." She closed her eyes then, just for a moment. Overwhelmed by the weight of it, all their history, their battles, their twisted path to this strange, unexpected tenderness. When she opened them again, his face was closer, and she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just let herself feel the pull, the gravity, the invitation to surrender. He leaned in, slow as dusk, until their foreheads touched, and in that stillness, everything stilled. Time, thoughts, resistance. Her hand gripped his softly now, no longer trembling, and she let her eyes flutter closed against the heat of his skin. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered, not out of fear, but of truth. "I don't either," he said, "but I want to find out. With you." And that was enough. That was everything. No promises, no apologies. Just a neighbors who had finally stopped pretending, finally stopped pushing, finally stopped hiding. And somewhere deep in that quiet space between them, something tender bloomed. The space between them had become something sacred, an invisible thread pulled tighter with every passing second. Every glance held too long, every breath shared in silence. They weren't touching anymore, but it was as though their bodies remembered, as though every nerve still tingled with the echo of fingertips brushing, of skin nearly brushing skin. And in that echo, in that suspended anticipation, there bloomed a question that neither of them dared ask aloud. How long could they keep pretending that this tension hadn't become something else entirely? That the gravity between them wasn't leading them toward a moment they wouldn't be able to come back from? She could feel it pulsing under her skin, a hum in her chest that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with proximity, his presence like a storm approaching, slow and heavy and inevitable. He was still sitting close, his knee nearly grazing hers, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to the forearms in that unthinking, devastatingly casual way. And yet, there was nothing casual about the way he was watching her now, like he was trying to memorize every shadow her face cast in the low light, every shift in her expression. She tried to look away to break the pull, but her gaze lingered on his jawline, on the soft stubble catching the lamplight. On the way his throat moved when he swallowed slowly, like something in him was caught too. "You keep looking at me like that," he murmured, voice low and roughened by something unspoken. "And I'm going to do something we'll both regret." Her breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition, because she had been thinking the same thing, had been waiting for him to say it, to name the weight that had been building in the silence between them. She should have laughed, should have made one of her sharp remarks, should have deflected. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe we wouldn't regret it." Just like that, something broke open. The air shifted, heavier, sharper, soaked with the thrill and danger of crossing a line they'd both danced around for too long. He didn't move toward her right away. He waited. He watched. He gave her the space to pull back, to shake her head, to pretend the words hadn't left her lips. But she didn't. She stayed exactly where she was, holding his gaze, her chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate rhythm. And that was all it took. The next second, he leaned in slow, cautious, reverent, as if afraid the moment might shatter under the weight of their hunger. His hand rose, tentative at first, and hovered beside her cheek, not quite touching, fingers trembling with restraint. And then, when she didn't flinch, he let them settle against her skin. The touch was gentle, unbearably so, his thumb tracing a path along her cheekbone, his palm cradling the side of her face, like she was something delicate, something that could break. She tilted into it, just slightly. Just enough to show him she didn't want him to stop. "Tell me to go," he murmured, his forehead nearly touching hers now, his voice thick with the effort it took to hold himself still. "Tell me now, or I won't be able to." She closed her eyes, not in retreat, but in surrender, and exhaled a breath that felt like months of resistance unraveling all at once. "Stay," she said, barely audible. "Just stay." That was all he needed. The kiss, when it came, was not a crash, it was a slow ignition, a long-held breath finally exhaled. His lips met hers in a tentative graze, like he was asking permission even now, even after everything. She answered not with words, but with the way her fingers found his shirt. The way she drew him closer, the way she kissed him back, like the weeks and months and years of pushing him away, had all led to this one trembling moment. It was soft and desperate at the same time, sweet and sharp, the kind of kiss that tasted like surrender and slow-burning fire. His hand slid into her hair, fingers threading gently, anchoring her to him as his other hand found her waist, drawing her in with aching reverence, and she let him. She let herself lean into every sensation, into every whisper of skin and breath and the quiet sounds they made when the world around them began to dissolve. They weren't neighbors anymore, not in this moment. Not rivals, not adversaries. They were something else entirely, to people clinging to a feeling too big to name, too powerful to deny. They broke apart only when breath became necessary, and even then they stayed close. Foreheads pressed together, their hands still tangled, still reaching. "What are we doing?" she asked softly, eyes fluttering open to meet his. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held no certainty but all the feeling in the world. "Something we should have done a long time ago," he said, voice thick with wonder. And maybe he was right. Maybe they had spent too long fighting a gravity that had always been there, waiting to pull them in. Outside, the world went on, cars passed, lights flickered, time moved forward. But inside that room, they remained suspended in the space where something old had ended and something terrifying and beautiful had begun. They had crossed the line. Neither of them wanted to go back. The apartment fell into a sudden and complete hush as the power went out without warning. The overhead light flickered once, hesitated, and then died, leaving only the faintest silver glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The air conditioner's hum vanished, the refrigerator stilled, and the city outside seemed to hold its breath along with them. But inside that pause, inside the dimmed hush of that modest living room, there was no fear, no surprise, only a strange and fragile sense of peace. They didn't move, not even to comment on the outage. There was no need to fill the space with explanations or small talk. Instead, the darkness wrapped around them like a velvet cocoon, quieting everything that wasn't essential. She remained curled against his side, her breath warm against his collarbone, and he held her just a little tighter, as if instinctively knowing that what had blossomed between them was too delicate for the harshness of artificial light. Time didn't behave the same way in that room anymore, stretched and softened, unfolding and long. Slow moments filled with the subtle sound of breath, the faint brush of fingertips, the silent confession of two bodies leaning into each other without resistance. The electricity may have failed, but something else had sparked low and slow, like embers under ash, glowing softly in the quiet. Her fingers played absently with the hem of his shirt, the rhythm of it hypnotic, comforting. He didn't speak, but his touch responded to her in kind, tracing the arc of her spine with a care that felt almost reverent. They had fought each other for so long, wrapped in irritation and pride, mistaking the heat between them for hatred. But now, in the cool quiet of a powerless evening, all that tension had shifted into something unspoken and raw, something neither of them had the vocabulary to name. She rested her head fully against his chest, letting the steady beat of his heart pull her deeper into the stillness. There was no pretense anymore, no guarded walls or verbal jabs to keep them apart. The silence between them had transformed into an understanding so intimate it didn't require articulation. Every breath she drew seemed to carry a new softness. Every shared glance held the weight of all the things they'd refused to see. He reached for the blanket draped over the couch's arm, and with a slow, tender motion, tucked it gently around her shoulders. That simple act unraveled her completely. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was deeply intentional. It was him saying, "I see you," and she let herself feel seen. She could sense the shift in him, too. His arm that now encircled her waist wasn't stiff or tentative. It was grounded. It said he wasn't going anywhere. Not in that moment, and maybe not in the moments after either. She tilted her face upward to look at him in the dark, and though she could barely make out his features, she didn't need to see them to feel the way he looked at her. That soft attention, that careful stillness, he wasn't just surprised by what had happened. He was moved, changed, and so was she. Something unspoken passed between them then. Not a vow, not a declaration, but a mutual surrender. Silent agreement to stop pretending they didn't care. Outside, the city pulsed on and the distant sirens echoing. Neighbors calling out, footsteps across upper floors, but their apartment felt like its own separate world, removed from obligation, from expectation, from the noise of their past. She felt the quiet become thicker around them, but instead of discomfort, it felt like a cradle. The kind of silence that held rather than excluded. He leaned closer, resting his cheek lightly against her hair, his hand moving in a slow, grounding motion along her side, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself to fall deeper into the moment. Not because she trusted it entirely, but because it was real, because she didn't want to miss even a second of this unfolding closeness. "Will you stay?" he whispered eventually, his voice low and hushed, carrying none of the confidence he usually wore like armor. It wasn't a request for forever, not even for the night. Just a simple question asking her to remain there, in that place between them that had taken so long to find. She didn't answer right away. She needed to feel the question inside her body, to trace it against the parts of herself that still held doubt. But in that long breath of hesitation, she already knew the answer. She lifted her hand and placed it flat over his chest again, right where his heartbeat steadied her. That was her answer. He didn't speak again. He just let his forehead touch hers for a moment, not kissing, not pressing, just resting there in the dark. The proximity spoke louder than words. It said, "Thank you." It said, "I've been waiting." It said, "I won't break this if you don't." And as they sat in the dim hush, wrapped in the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement from an earlier drizzle and the warmth of shared breath, she felt something settle inside her. Not certainty, not clarity, but something softer. Something like hope. There were no labels in that silence. No us or this. Just the strange comfort of being close to someone who had once driven her mad, and now made her feel like she'd finally come home after years of wandering in the wrong direction. The tension between them hadn't disappeared, had just melted into something more complex. Something that pulsed with vulnerability and quiet yearning. In the dark, there were no promises. But there was a beginning. And sometimes that's all two people need. The night lingered in the corners of the room like a secret it didn't want to let go of.
Outside, the world moved on.
Distant music drifted through the air. A dog barked once and then fell silent again. But none of that mattered. Not in here. Not in the space where something unspoken had taken shape between two people who used to slam their doors too hard, avoid the elevator, and mutter each other's names like insults. Now there was only warmth and breath and silence, and the strange comfort of bodies that had finally stopped resisting the pull that had always been there, waiting beneath the surface. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet. That made it even more powerful. She didn't say goodbye when she finally stood up. She didn't need to. Her fingers brushed his shoulder gently as she passed, and he looked up at her with an expression that asked nothing but understood everything. There was no need for promises, not yet. Just that one look, the one that held 100 small moments of recognition. They were still who they had been, still proud, still stubborn, still neighbors. But now there was a softness in the space between them, a kind of fragile truce held together by shared silence and the memory of hands that had finally reached across the line they swore they'd never cross. She stepped out into the hallway, the bare soles of her feet making no sound on the cold tile. The darkness followed her like a cloak, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It felt calm. It felt real. She didn't look back, but she could feel him behind her, leaning against the doorway, watching her with something in his chest that wasn't frustration for once. Maybe tomorrow, they'd argue again about laundry rooms or packages left in the wrong place. Maybe they'd fall back into old habits, bristle and snap and retreat. But something had changed. Something had been spoken without words. Once spoken, even in silence, it could not be taken back. In the quiet of her own apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed and let the stillness settle over her like a blanket. Her fingers curled around the fabric of her shirt where his hand had rested, as if trying to keep the shape of his touch just a little longer. She closed her eyes and the world blurred into breath and memory, the soft heat of his arm around her, the tremble in his voice when he asked her to stay, the way they didn't rush to fill the silence. It all lived in her now, glowing in the dark, like a candle cupped in both hands. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to find out. And across the hall, he stood still for a long time. The door open, the night quiet, the air still warm from where she had been. He didn't try to make sense of it. He didn't try to plan or fix or define it. He just let himself feel at every flicker of vulnerability, every lingering trace of her presence. For once he didn't push it away, he let it stay. Because sometimes the loudest beginnings happen in the quiet that follows everything else.